In the start of this year, we made this little teaser called Elation. In this project, I was trying out a lot of different approaches, just seeing how powerful Blender really has become with the viewport compositor, with the help of some AI tools, even with the help of Eevee. Yes, one of the shots in this animation was actually done in Eevee, but I don't think most people would notice. I'm gonna try to share as much as possible with you today, trying to not go too much into detail, but teach you just enough so you can apply all these different hacks and tricks into your own projects. If you like automotive, this is probably a pretty good video for you to watch, so stick around. A really important thing about this animation was the environment, and a lot of people have been asking about how we got the environment and how we basically set it up. This is actually the base mesh that we used for the animation. And as you can see, this is not super detailed, it looks pretty basic. The true value of this mesh here is that it's coming from real life data. You'll start to notice when you look closer that it has a lot of the elevation and the track actually makes sense. So this here was actually based on a scan that you can buy online of this track, so you can also go on Google Maps and sometimes you can find this 3D telemetry data in there. And you can see how this scan, this is a drone scan, it has all the beautiful details of the track, and it's actually the best reference you can get of how the track looks, because you can see it and sort of discover it in 3D space. So this here is Sven from the Launch Control team. He was the one who actually took this scan and was building out a proper mesh for it. And why do we actually build out another mesh when we already have the scan, you might ask? The reason is the scan looks great from distance, but as soon as you get close, then you can start to see everything falling apart, and you can see how low quality and low res everything is. So you can see there's no way we can put a camera here and make a nice shot because we simply don't have enough detail, neither in the mesh nor in the textures. So as an example, this is one of the actual shot files. Actually, this is the look dev file, or the look development file, which was the first one that we were working on when we were doing the short. So this here is for the first shot where the car is sort of driving here on the side, and you have all these nice lights casting reflections on the car. And again, here, what we've just talked about, like taking this base mesh, which doesn't look super detailed, was exactly what we did. And then we started to add in the lighting, and after that we started adding the detail we needed. So what we want to do now is prepare our Hennessy Venom car model, because that's also essential. I mean, this is the hero of the shot anyway. So what I usually do is to start what I call a look dev file. So this here is just a file where I set up an HDRI map and I start to dial in the materials of the car to get them all to feel right. And then afterwards, I'm going to use this in all the different shot files. You can see here we have some white car paint that has a little bit of that glint inside of it. We have some carbon fiber that's set up, has a nice clear coat on top. And here you can sort of make sure that everything looks balanced and good. One of the most important things when working with colors for cars like this, or for anything that needs to be looking realistic, is to make sure that it's not too bright. As you can see, this red color here, many people have a tendency to just take the red and then boost the value all the way to 1, like something like this. But you can see it's almost emitting light now. It doesn't look very realistic anymore. And this is our sense that it should be 1, but actually it shouldn't. It should be more like 25% value. So you can keep the saturation super high, but drop the value quite a bit more than you might think, which would actually still look very red and very strong. The same thing goes on with like these brake calipers. You can see here, again, nothing complicated, but just here we have a very, very low value to make sure that these are not like blue like this, because that will instantly make it look very CG and very fake. There's also a whole bunch of other tricks you can use to just improve the shading of the car. Something like tinting the windows a little bit green can sometimes make it look really, really nice there. And then also making sure that when you're doing your tires, you can see how here we basically have 2 different materials. I don't know if you can notice it here, but this outside is much more glossy. And then this side here is basically the surface patches where it's touching the ground. That's more like a diffuse, bright color. A few other notes is on your brake caliper, make sure to use anisotropic shaders. The same thing goes for all the carbon fiber. You can sort of see these kind of streaks of reflection here. So what we can do here is just turn off the clear coat for now, and you can really see what I mean. They have this sort of streaks, which is coming from the anisotropic shader. And then on top of that, we just add a clear coat. So this is just added inside the principled BSDF shader. One other trick I'm often using for the taillights is to use yellow emitters inside the red taillights, because that usually makes a really nice, interesting play with the colors. So if I were to just use a red shader instead of this yellow shader, what would happen is it would look like this when it's connected. And it might also look fine, but it's more like becoming pink rather than this very hot orange color. So I really like this orange color, and it just plays really well with the red, I think. For the headlights, it's also a little bit of a personal interpretation, I guess, but I also like to tint it a little bit blue just to get a little more color in there. And you can see how this glass in particular has a bump map on it, and it just adds a lot of fine little detail, making it almost look like it's some sort of dusted or rough glass. And then, very importantly, make sure that your headlights have a lot of detail so you actually get these very nice and crisp reflections inside. For the animation, so that would mean the actual animation of the car. So that's what I usually refer to as the action, and also the camera animation. So the first thing to note is, of course, we're a little bit biased, but we used Launch Control, the animation tool for cars. So you can see here on the left side of the screen that we have the full animation of the car going around the track. So with Launch Control, we're able to just get the speed, we're able to get even the G-forces that the car is experiencing all around the track, which helps us make a realistic animation of the car. So this just means we're not cheating, we are not making the car animation fit the camera, but rather we are building the full realistic animation based on realistic values. And we also intelligently placed this driving path, which is us determining exactly where the car will be and where it will move. Then based on that, we can afterwards go in and actually plan our shots or play like virtual cinematographers, making each shot exactly like we want. So specifically for the animation of the car, we used a feature called speed segments inside Launch Control. And the reason is that that gives us very nice control over the exact car speed at different points in time, making it very easy to just change stuff around if we needed to. This also gives you a nice overview of the different sections of the track. So right here, we're just focusing on this part here. You can see how we have the car coming out of a turn with around 100 kilometers per hour, then going to 150 and 190 before braking. So you can see here the graph is always showing you the exact speed that the car would have at any point in time. So the approach I like to do when I'm making animations like this is to do what you call a previs. So that's a previsualization. Basically, this is a file where you set up the entire animation and then you start to place the cameras one by one. And this is just clay. You don't see the final rendering, anything like that. But it's very important that you can do this fast and iterate fast. So you can try out different things and then figure out what mistakes you're making before you actually start to spend time rendering anything. This way you can build your own little previs, which again just helps you find out what sort of objects you want. Here again, we can see, well, for this case, we actually need this lap counter here, which means later we might want to go in and actually model a high quality version of that. Since you remember from the beginning, we didn't do that for all the shots. So if you want to get a little bit more into automotive animation, we can highly recommend the Automotive Animation Essentials course because, well, we created that one. We created it specifically because animating cars is pretty difficult. You might think that it's pretty basic, but when you start to dive deeper into it, you realize there's so many different layers and so many different things that can affect how a vehicle is moving. Apart from that, there's also the camera animations, and they are crucial for making your animation look nice and also sell the cinematic vibe. Apart from that, we also go much deeper into how to animate with the speed segments inside Launch Control, making it super easy to do correct animations, and also it helps you to iterate faster. The course is focused on getting you from a beginner or maybe intermediate user of Blender for automotive animation to an absolute professional level where you can go out and make animations just like this one we did. And we want to teach you how to do that by teaching you the correct professional workflow that we are using at studios when we are working on animations like this one. Apart from that, we're also discussing some real live footage or some real references, understanding how cars actually look on the road, how they are reacting to accelerations and turns and things like that. So if you're serious about getting to the next level of automotive animation, we'll highly recommend that you check out this course. You can watch the first 2 lessons for free on the website, or you can buy the course on Gumroad. Let's take a look at some of the really fun stuff, which is actually rendering and lighting. And this here will be sort of a mix of a lot of different things because for this project, we were doing so much stuff in the actual render viewport. So what we would be seeing in the render viewport was almost always the exact result we would have in the end. Except for some of the rain effects, which were actually added in comp. So let's take a look at it. This is the first shot of the animation, and you can see we have sort of this setup here. It's very close to the car. Again, like we were talking about before, everything looks absolutely trash. It's just this specific area that we need for this shot that we are caring about. Everything else we really don't care about. There are a few different things going on here. They are basically the lighting, there are the rain effects, and there is in the end the compositing. So first of all, let's just turn off the compositing inside the viewport, because then we can focus in just on the lighting, and then in the end we'll take a look at the compositing and what that's doing. What we have is just some tail lights and headlights. And we actually also have, so we have the actual meshes here that are emitting. And then we also have some nice headlights here. So these are the ones that are coming with launch control. And these just make some patterns on the road, which can look pretty nice. For the tail lights, we don't really have anything like that because they are usually more foggy and diffuse. So let's turn on the things one by one. Let's first turn on the world and see what that's doing. This HDRI is from HDRI Haven. So the original actually looks like this, but I was sort of color grading it inside the tree here. So basically changing the colors a lot and tweaking it, kind of making it dark and moody and having these teal and orange colors. The second layer of lighting is simply the scene lighting. So here, what looks really nice, and for many car animations in general, is to have some sort of practical lights in the scene that are casting some more localized light. And you can see here what I was doing. I just have two area lights with a pretty small size, very high power, and then 60 degrees in spread. And I put them like this with some distance in between. So the next thing we want to take a look at is the water splashing effects. So those are done with the Bagger Rain Generator add-on, but you could technically do it with other tools as well, or you could do it yourself inside Blender with particles. And you can see how, because we have the nice headlights and especially also the tail light area lights inside the scene, we get this very nice coloring of the rain. Then we have the spray, which is also generated by the Bagger Rain Generator, which looks really nice, and is sort of these splashes coming off of the car. And you can see here, especially picking that tail light up here, like looks so nice, especially in motion. The last layer we have is called volume. And we can see here what it sort of does. So this here is just a volume shader that's on a big box. So you can see here at the bottom, we have a box here, which has a volume on it. So if you go here to the object shading, you can see here it has a little bit of color, a little bit of density. So we're using some different noise textures, plugging that into the density to make it change depending on where you are in the scene. But this just adds sort of like this glow from the taillights as well, which again, we are adding on top. And since we're rendering in different layers, we can always combine and match stuff in post if you want. So for the actual foliage or the trees and stuff like that inside the scene, what we're using is a geoscatter. So in this case, we needed some trees here in the corner as the car turns around here. We needed some trees to populate the area in here. And geoscatter just has some really nice presets that you can drop in, and then you can place them exactly where you need. And you can see here, this is how we just added a bunch of trees in the background when the car turns around the corner. You can't really see much, to be honest, because all the volume and all the lighting and everything like that is just covering up everything. But that also adds to the realism as it gets very, very misty and very rough and raw, which was the exact thing we wanted this to feel like. So if we were to take a look at the lighting for this shot, it's actually pretty simple. It's just an HDRI map that we are using a few mapping nodes to sort of rotate and change so it fits better into the scene. You can see one of the things I'm doing is actually scaling down the Y, so basically squeezing it together a little bit. And you can see how this is really changing the lighting a lot. So what I wanted here was a lot of backlight and a lot of focus on the car. So I didn't want any directional light in the scene. So if I would just put in the HDRI map as it is, it would look like this. It looks very nice, but you have this very clear shadow behind the car, and you have very directional lighting. And that was simply not what I wanted for this specific shot. I just wanted a lot of backlight rather. So a lot of people have been asking about this last shot of the animation. So this here is seeing the track from far away, sort of like a drone shot, leaving the area. And the comment I got was from many people, how did you render all the trees? And one person got it almost right. He said, it's AI. Well, the thing is, it's actually not just a video generated. It's an upscaled image that I'm projecting onto the geometry. So this here I lit and rendered inside cycles, but the thing was I only rendered one frame. So you can see how this is, again, the scan data, which doesn't look super nice. It just lacks a lot of detail. And then when I was happy with it, I took the furthest away frame, so that would be the last frame of the animation. I rendered it in a little bit higher quality, And then I used Magnific, which is a really nice AI upscaler, to do style transfer on that render. So the result of that was, so this here was the car render coming out of Blender. So what I did was actually make 2 different generations. So you can see this was the sort of the best looking one, but if you zoom in, you can see the details make no sense anymore. Like, this looks like a farm, there's no racetrack, nothing is right anymore. And that's where you need to go in and actually fix the mistakes the AI is making. So in this case, I also made another one, which is just slightly upscale. So you can see it looks nice. It still looks like a racetrack because it is still a racetrack. And then I would blend these 2 in Photoshop. So basically just painting in the details I wanted from each version. So here, I maybe like the grass from the other ones. So I would just paint here, paint in the grass again. And then inside Blender, what I would do was to literally project that back onto some geometry that I made, which is sort of approximation of this entire environment. And there we go. This was the final projection I was doing. And you can see we still have this specular highlight thing going on here in the back. But since we're putting in lens flare on top of everything, you don't really see this. So again, let's turn on the compositor and we can see what the final shot actually looks like. So in the animation, I also used this sort of raindrops running across the surface of the car. And maybe you would be surprised that this shot with the sort of the back piece of carbon of the car, it's actually just rendered in Eevee. So when I was doing the previs, I realized that this shot, you can't really see what's going on unless you're actually rendering it, because there's this animated texture on this carbon fiber piece where the raindrops are sort of running down. So I did it in the previs and then I thought it looked good enough for the final render. So this here is exactly what's in the render, just a little bit color graded differently. So this was super fast to do. And even the motion blur inside Eevee worked super well for this shot. So for my render settings, what I used for this project was generally the same across the board. The only thing I was changing was the noise threshold a little bit up and down, depending on how much noise a certain render would have. So what I like to do is set my max samples to something very high, because that is basically the upper limit for how many samples each pixel on the screen is allowed to get. If Cycles can create a clean result without 8,000 samples, it will just finish and call it a day. So you can set it to something like 1,000. I like to do something like 8,000 to make sure that even the hardest spots become clean, but it will take a little bit longer to render. So what we want to do now is just take a little look at what the noise threshold is doing. So to be able to see what's actually happening, we need to turn off the denoiser first. And now we can actually see the noise that's in the image. The denoiser is just really good at cleaning up all this stuff so we don't even notice that it's there. If we set the noise threshold to something like 0.5, you can see how Cycles already considers this render done at this level, but there's clearly a lot of noise in here that it never even gets to clean up. But because the noise threshold is so high, our acceptance of noise is really, really high, which means that this amount of noise is totally acceptable for Cycles. If we start to dial this down to something like 0.1, you will see that it cleans up better. And let's just focus in on this area because we can already feel that this area is the really hard area. So let's focus in on this. And you can see now Cycles is actually doing a better job of cleaning this stuff up. One last thing is, of course, the denoiser. When we add that on top, the denoiser takes care of all these small noise patterns in the end, or this noise that's left over even after rendering for a long time, and cleans all that up. So with this in mind, we want to find a setting that gives us a good performance, but also renders a relatively clean image. So let's do a test render with the settings we have here. So this is 0.01 and 8,000 samples as like a maximum limit of when you reached 8,000, just stop, then it's fine. We have the denoiser turned on. I'm using the light tree setting, which usually just optimizes the lights in the scene. In this case, I don't think it's making a big difference because we don't have so many different lights. And for the light paths or the max bounces, I'm using these settings here. You can play around with it. The important thing is if you're using any volume in the scene, you should set the volume to more than 0 because otherwise you don't get the right bounces. Then we have the clamping settings, which I like to set to 0 to make sure that we don't clamp the headlights. The filter glossy can be really important if you have some sort of caustics in the scene, and generally I find reducing it a little bit from the default of 1 looks nicer, but in this case it doesn't make a big difference. For the motion blur, for this particular shot, I'm just using the default settings. That works pretty well. If you want to emulate sort of a GoPro camera, what you can do is go into the rolling shutter, change this to top and bottom, and then I find that you have to turn the shutter very, very high to be able to see the desired result. So this is what I'm using in this shot where we are very close to the car, sort of focused on the front wheel. And this is what makes it look like a GoPro because when it's shaking, it's sort of like skewing the image a little bit and it can look really, really cool. Lastly, I'm using tiling and 2000 in tile size. This is the default setting, can work pretty well. And I am not using persistent data for the final render. That is because in certain shots, I do have issues when I'm using this. Checking persistent data is usually faster, but it can introduce artifacts in your scene. So I would recommend try turning it on, see if it renders correctly. If you have any issues, this should be the first checkbox that you will check off, because that is usually the case that this one is causing the issues. And finally, we get to the export. But first, a little disclaimer. I was the only artist working on shots for this project, and because of that, I used an experimental workflow I made inside Blender, where I'm doing all the compositing and color grading, basically inside Blender. That means I could get away with exporting in a limited color space. But please make sure you understand the limitations of this workflow before you use it for yourself. Don't see this as a standard workflow, but rather an experimental workflow that will work for some projects, but not for others. For better resources on color spaces and exporting for external compositors, check out Inlight VFX on YouTube. They have great guides for these things. And with that, back to the video. So I like to use DaVinci Resolve to do my edits, and this is where I'm putting everything together. Also because it has the superpower of having Fusion in there, which is a really nice compositor if you need to do some compositing on the shots as well. But as we already discussed, the compositing for this animation was pretty simple. My export node tree looked like this. I literally had my render output, I ran it through some post-processing inside Blender. So in this case, this was only a photographer post effects. And then I'm exporting a single 16-bit image sequence, and that's it. So basically, when I drag and drop that into Resolve, I have something that already looks like this. And all I do in Resolve is just add a little bit of color grading here in the end, mostly just warming most of the shots. What I also do in Resolve is add a little bit of film grain on some of these shots, because that's easy to do in post, because then you have full control in the end. But basically all the effects, all the bloom, all the glare, I'm looking right inside the Blender viewport, dialing it in, making sure it looks right before I render, and then I don't have all the work to do in compositing afterwards. So that was an overview over how we did most of the effects, the rendering, the lighting for this elation short film. Apart from that, if you're into automotive, I really recommend you to check out the Launch Control Discord, which is a place where we talk about vehicles, we talk about Blender, we talk about 3D, we talk about automotive animation, and we are around 2,000 people now. Many of us using Blender, but all those softwares are welcome too. You can check it out, chat with some people, ask some questions, and also share the work you've been doing in there. That's it for this time. See you around.